Hello and welcome to HMO History, where today we're looking at GCSE Superpower Relations and the Cold War. I'm a 5-year experienced teacher, and for 3 of those years I've been head of history, and I'll be sharing with you my top tips for getting grades 7 to 9 in this GCSE Paper 3. Today is lesson 2, and we're going to be looking at Soviet expansion. Let's go. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about how Stalin intended to build what he called his buffer zone. We're going to be looking at how did the West react to fears presented in the long telegram, and we'll be looking at how Stalin tried to establish Soviet control over what was known as satellite states in Eastern Europe. Now let's dig a bit deeper into what satellite states actually are. If we look at this map, we can see an indication of the types of countries that were under Soviet influence during the Cold War. By definition, a satellite state is a country that is controlled by or dependent on a more powerful country. So the more powerful country that we have here is the Soviet Union, and as you can see, countries that are surrounding its borders have become satellite states. But what benefits would Stalin actually gain from creating what he wanted to be known as a buffer zone of satellite states around the western border of the Soviet Union? Well, there are lots of different benefits that he saw. Protection from a potential invasion. After coming off the back of World War II, he wanted to protect himself from any further expansionist ideas. He wanted to expand his own ideology, that being communism. It would also provide him access to better resources and land. It would gain him more supporters and a larger population to control in general, access to a potentially larger military, and it was just seen as a show of strength to prove to the West that he was a strong militaristic leader. So why then were tensions growing at Stalin's attempt to build this buffer zone? It was evident following the Potsdam Conference that there were cracks beginning to show in the relationship that had once been strong during the Grand Alliance. The US and the USSR did not agree on some fundamental issues that had arisen at the Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam conferences. Truman and Stalin themselves were worried about this future conflict, and it played a part in how they acted towards one another. Each one wanted to know what their rival was thinking. In 1946, both of them asked their embassies to report on what their fears and suspicions were of the other. The embassies reported to their leaders via telegrams, a written message sent over a telegraph line. We had 2 telegrams. One was sent by George Kennan, who was the US ambassador in the British embassy in Moscow, and one that was sent by Nikolai Novikov, who was the USSR ambassador in the Soviet Union embassy in the United States. Let's look a bit closer at what was known as the long telegram sent by George Kennan. As the American ambassador in Moscow, George Kennan sent a long message in February 1946. This was known as the long telegram because it contained over 8,000 words. It was sent to Truman about Soviet attitudes towards the USA, and it led to several US worries. Within the telegram, it was stated that the USSR thought the outside world wanted to destroy communism, and that Stalin himself wanted to destroy capitalism in return. It meant that hostility between the two was inevitable. The Soviet leaders were deeply distrustful of the outside world, and this fueled some aggressive foreign policy. And negotiations, much like what we had seen earlier, would now only be entered to if the Soviets saw they could gain the upper hand. However, Kennan did express that the USSR would back down if the US applied pressure, firmly but patiently. It was now clear that both superpowers were set on a path of hostility towards one another. This was mostly due to the ideas of expansion, Stalin's buffer zone, and then containment from the US. Containment essentially was to stop the spread of communism and an attempt to protect democratic and capitalist systems worldwide. However, expansionism, as we had seen, was to spread the communist ideology and expand Soviet influence, especially in Eastern Europe and the developing world. So what was the importance of containment from the perspective of the US? My exam tip here is that when you're answering a question on importance, it is very important to consider the links between events that you are describing in the question and events that it's going to lead to further on. We're always thinking throughout this course about cause and consequence. What event are you describing? And how did it lead or trigger another? Containment became the main reason for US involvement in the Cold War, and it led to further interceptive measures, which we'll focus on in the next episode. The Truman Doctrine in 1947 and the Marshall Plan. The USSR saw containment as aggressive and kicked off a long period of mistrust and rivalry. It led to later alliances such as NATO, and it proved the US were now shifting from isolationism pre-World War II to now perceiving themselves as a global protector of democracy worldwide. In response to the long telegrams sent by Kennan, we have the Novikov telegram that was sent by Nikolai Novikov. The Soviet ambassador provided his own perspective in 1946 of what he felt was US hostility towards the East. He claimed the US was using economic and military power to establish world domination, and he described Truman as imperialistic. He said that he was unwilling to cooperate and he was trying to use anti-Soviet propaganda in the United States. This in turn hardened the attitudes of the USSR, and it told Soviet leaders that the US could not be trusted. If the West were preparing for a war, it also justified the Soviets having a firmer grip on their satellite states in Eastern Europe, and it began to make cooperation between the two superpowers even more difficult. Let's look a little bit further on how Stalin was able to secure Soviet control over these satellite states. Going back to the map we looked at the start, I'm now going to dig deeper into each of these countries in chronological order. First, it was the Baltic states. In 1940, they were conquered by the USSR and they became part of the Soviet Union, places like Estonia and Lithuania. Then Albania and Yugoslavia. In 1945, despite establishing a pro-communist government, they didn't fall into direct control of the Soviet Union because they were never occupied by the Red Army. In 1945 and 1946, we saw the occupation of Bulgaria and Romania. Voters were intimidated by communists in the free elections, so they were not in fact free. Poland was then invaded by the Red Army after the Warsaw Uprising was crushed. The London Poles were forced to flee as communist governments took charge after their so-called free elections. In Czechoslovakia, the communists staged a coup in February 1948 under Stalin's pressure. The democratic government led by Beneš was replaced. And finally, control over Hungary was achieved in 1949. In the 1947 election, voters had been intimidated by Moscow, and support by the communists grew. By 1949, it was a one-party state. So why is Soviet expansion so significant in the wider scheme of things? Well, it showed that there were fears of political aggression, and they were starting to become a reality. Stalin was pushing Soviet control over the East, and the US were on a path of implementing containment in the West. It shows that a lot of decisions were based on fears and assumptions, but it did have an effect on shaping international policy, and collaboration was fast becoming unachievable, with both the East and the West gearing up for potential military conflict. This lesson forms part of a wider series of videos looking at revision of superpower relations in the Cold War. If you missed the first video, you can find it here to catch up on everything we spoke about in regards to origins of the Cold War.